time to jump right back into the world of Windows handhelds with the upcoming OneXFly from OneXPlayer. For the first time ever on the channel, I will be checking out a OneXPlayer product, and not only that, but it will be the first time I get hands-on with AMD's Ryzen 7 7840U with Radeon 780M graphics. And as you might have guessed, the OneXFly is powered by said Ryzen 7840U, and will be packed into an incredibly sleek package with a nearly bezel-less 120Hz display. So I hope you will join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore this new offering from OneXPlayer and get familiar with the OneXFly and see just what kind of experience the most compact and powerful 7840U handheld brings to the palm of your hands. It's time to drop some specs on the OneXFly, which comes equipped with a 7-inch ultra-thin bezel display with a 1920 by 1080 resolution and 120Hz refresh rate. The unit I have on hand is a prototype and as such does not feature that 120Hz refresh rate. It's powered by the Phoenix-based AMD Ryzen 7 7840U with a base frequency of 3.3 GHz and boosts up to 5.1 GHz, with Radeon 780M graphics and is built on the Taiwan Semiconductor 4nm fab. The OneXFly will ship in multiple configurations and features 16, 32, or 64 GB of LPDDR5X RAM clocked at 7500 MHz and an M.2 NVMe PCI Express 4.0 internal storage ranging from 512 GB up to 4 TB. The unit I've been provided with features 16 GB of RAM and 1 TB of internal storage. The OneXFly has the ability to expand storage via the micro SD slot. It includes a 48 Wh battery with support for 65W charging, Wi-Fi 6E, and Bluetooth 5.2. There's 2 USB-C 4.0 ports, a USB-A 3.2 port, and Harman Audio EFX dual speakers, with Windows 11 out of the box. OneXPlayer is currently running their Indiegogo campaign for the OneXFly, and as I mentioned, it will ship in various SKUs, and so I'll show this graphic on screen so we can check out the pricing and various options. The OneXFly will start at an early bird price of $739 and goes all the way up to $1,299 for the maxed out configuration. Lastly, I wanted to thank OneXPlayer for sending me this prototype unit to evaluate, and as I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's just quickly check out what was sent to me by OneXPlayer. I have to admit I was pretty excited when I saw that one netbook tape on the box, as it's my first time being able to cover one of their products. I'll use my trusty X-Acto knife and cleanly crack this seal, and well, let's fold this box out and check out the bubble wrap action. Now I tried to pop some of these on camera for everyone, but failed tremendously, so no ASMR segment. Actually, I take that back, I got one pop out of it. Okay, so it looks like we have the charger here, so let's put that aside briefly and get this bubble wrap package out of the box. It looks like we have a nice fitted case here with the OneXPlayer branding. Let's carefully unzip. And there is the OneXFly in its protective baggie. But hold on, let's check out this charger before we go any further. This is going to be a pretty substantial AC adapter, as the OneXFly does support 65W charging, and you can see that it is using a USB Type-C port on the adapter itself. And finally, we have a nice braided USB Type-C to Type-C cable. Now back to the main attraction, and let's get this plastic bag off the OneXFly and reveal what is waiting inside. This looks really nice in person and feels nice in the hands, and now that it's been freed from its bag, let's take a tour around the OneXFly and get to know it better. As we always do, let's start out at the top right, and the OneXFly is using that stacked shoulder button configuration. The right bumper is pressing down well and can be pressed down properly all across the length of the button. Below that, we have the analog trigger. These press down smoothly with a little bit of resistance. It's not overly difficult to press down, and I feel that it's just the right amount of tension. The shape of the trigger accommodates your fingers well with just the right amount of range in the travel. Right beside the right bumper button, we have an additional programmable shoulder button. This will require that you move your hand a little bit over to reach it. Continuing on, we have that full-size USB-A 3.2 port, one of the USB 4.0 Type-C ports, a 3.5mm port for headsets, and a system indicator light. Below these inputs, there is an exhaust vent for the active cooling. Moving on, we have the volume up and down rocker, which has an angle to the plastic piece and is raised at each end to easily press down on. Beside that, we have the power button, the left programmable shoulder button, and then the stacked shoulder button configuration on the left side. The left bumper is pressing down similar to the right side. Likewise for the left trigger, which has smooth movement as well. Continuing down that left side, here we have a peek at that contrasting plastic piece, which has a different material than the rest of the body. It's where the customizable RGB emblem will shine through as well. And speaking of, you will notice that I had a bit of fun here and removed the prototype cream cake emblem and had a friend print out a tiny emblem for me on her Cricut. As you can see, my version is not perfect, but OneXPlayer is offering the ability to customize your own emblem on both sides of the device. We'll talk more about this in just a little bit. Continuing on to the bottom of the unit, we have one of the down-firing speakers, and this is one of the key standouts for the OneXFly with that Harman Audio EFX 2.0 system. You can see that these are pretty sizable. A little down the line, and we have that second USB 4.0 Type-C port and the micro SD slot for storage expansion. And finally, the right stereo speaker. Just like on the left, we have the same piece of contrasting plastic on the right side, which allows one of the customizable emblems to show through. And I did want to quickly show that these are actually pretty simple to take off, starting from that corner right above the speaker grill. Now you can see what it looks like exposed without that piece on there. Here's a closer look at the standard OneXFly emblem and how it slides in and out of its slot. You can always opt to take out the customization or the standard emblem and just have plain RGB lights. And placing the plastic back cover on is simple as well. Okay, let's continue on, and I will just comment and say I really do like the contrasting material. I think it gives it a pretty sharp and interesting look. Now let's take a look at the back of the OneXFly. Here's a little bit of a close-up of that interesting matte texture that's been applied to the plastic, and we will definitely be coming back to this. We have some Harman branding, the fairly substantial intake vent for the active cooling, OneXPlayer branding, and a sticker indicating that this is a prototype unit. Now let's go back frontside and check out what's going on the left. At the top, we have the Xbox style select button. Below that, we have the Hall-based analog stick, and despite the smaller cap, these are not clones of the Nintendo Switch analog stick. I really do wish that OneX opted for a larger cap on these though, as I feel that the smaller caps take away from these really nice sticks. And you can see how these sit above the face of the unit. Moving down, we have the D-pad, which reminds me very much of the original Xbox One controller, but despite looking similar at first glance, actually feels nothing like it. These are membrane-based, and I do like the way these feel. They press down well at each end with a good amount of travel, and there's a fairly solid pivot point in the center. You can see how these sit above the face of the OneXFly. I'm definitely curious to see how it performs in-game. Finally, right below the D-pad, we have an additional button which brings you back to the desktop in-game as well as other functions. On the side of the screen, there is a text that reads "Gaming Computer for Hardcore Gamers," and this also happens to be a great close-up shot of the very unique texture on this plastic. Let's head on over to the right side now, and at the top we have the Xbox-style start button. Below that, we have membrane-based buttons in the Xbox ABXY configuration. The typeface for the letters is very much in line with the OneX brand. Pressing down on these, and they have just the right amount of travel and sit nicely above the face of the device. I'm having no issues here with stuck buttons or any other weird finishing issues. The buttons have slight movement, but nowhere near something like the ROG Ally, which has a little more movement and as such makes much more noise when pressed down. The face buttons on the OneXFly are pretty quiet overall, and again, I do like the travel on these. Below that, we have the Hall-based right analog stick, and this clicks in well with smooth movement. Finally, we have two additional buttons. The one on the right is used to call up the keyboard in Windows and in-game, which is very useful to have. The button on the left is known as the turbo button, and this will allow you to bring up the OneXConsole overlay. Holding down on this button will bring up the OneXConsole Game Center to access your game library. Alright, so let's go ahead and turn this on for the first time. We will just move right along this part and speed up this process. As expected with a Windows device, you will have the usual setup process when first turning it on, including things like signing into your Microsoft account, connecting Wi-Fi, and everything else that entails. I wanted to briefly point out that this prototype does not have a native landscape display, and this applies to the final versions with the 120Hz screens as well. Welcome to your Windows 11 desktop, and I'm very pleased to see that this doesn't have any additional software installed beyond the standard Microsoft apps, which I definitely recommend removing a good portion of. The OneXFly will ship with the OneXConsole and launcher, which is actually quite a useful piece of software, and let's go through that a little and see what it offers and what it can do for us. So let's first check out the OneXConsole overlay tool that comes up on screen when pressing that turbo button. As you can see, it brings up the OneXConsole tool, and let's go ahead and switch into my direct feed so we can take a closer look. This is a great feature and quite usable, especially because it can be called up at any point in Windows or when you are in game. Starting at the top, you have the on-the-fly TDP adjustments, which certainly have made my life a lot easier doing all sorts of testing with the OneXFly. We can adjust the TDP from as low as 4 watts all the way up to 30 watts. Below that, we have the ability to adjust the CPU, and moving along, we have fan adjustments, as well as the ability to set presets for your own fan curves, vibration settings, on-the-fly resolution adjustments, which is another great feature to have, and next to that we can make adjustments to the RGB lighting profiles, and there are various presets available, as well as the ability to set to a static color. To the right of that, we have the option to automatically start HW Info and RTSS tools, which will prompt you to download the software if it is not already downloaded and installed. Once that's been done, you can simply click on this and OneXConsole will take care of everything in the backend. And then finally, below that, we have the quick access to brightness and volume control. Another neat toggle is the releasing memory to maximize the memory that is available to use. As you can see, I simply hit it and it released 1.1 gigabytes of RAM. Okay, so back to the Windows desktop, the OneXConsole also comes with an on-screen keyboard that can be called up using the dedicated button to the right of the turbo button. This is nothing too fancy, but again, functional and of course very practical to have in Windows. In addition, it has full support for the built-in controls, including quick inputs for certain actions. One final thing, let's take a look at the actual game center, which we can access holding down on the turbo button until it comes up on screen. As you can probably tell, this is the front end to launch your library of games from. It's a fairly simple piece of software, but not a bad option at all if you're looking for something to tie everything together on your OneXFly. I know that OneX has been working on this for a bit, rolling out frequent updates for the OneX line of devices. Now I've added some of my own games already, and so you can get a bit of a taste of what this looks like. So starting at the top, we have a few options. The power icon, as you would expect, allows you to close the software, shut down the handheld, or reboot the handheld. The option beside the power icon will minimize the OneX software. Moving along, we have the search feature, and then a few icons for Wi-Fi status, battery life, the time, and then finally your profile, which allows you to also check for updates. So pressing Y on the controller will bring up the ability to add a game by either having the software scan automatically, or you can add it manually by pointing to the .exe file in a directory. Selecting Add by Scan, and you can see quickly that it scans common install directories for Steam, Xbox, and Epic. I recently downloaded Doom Eternal to the device, and you can see that it did in fact pick up the game from Xbox Game Pass and populated the entry with images. You can also press start on a game icon and it will bring up various options for that specific game, including the ability to customize the title and images that are being used in the launcher. This is definitely useful as it will not always match the correct image. So with all of the software out of the way, let's focus back on the hardware and take a look at the build quality of this prototype unit. The OneXFly definitely feels really nice in the hands. I find it to be a very comfortable device to hold. Now putting it through the bending test, and there's absolutely no flexing or creaking in the frame. It's definitely very solid. The programmable shoulder button does rattle and doesn't feel as tightly finished as the rest of the unit. You can see how I can get the button to come up slightly when I'm tapping it with my finger. My right bumper button has a bit of movement in it compared to the one on the left, which is just a minor finishing detail, but the button does still work properly and it clicks in as it should. I mentioned briefly that I was disappointed with the smaller analog stick caps, which is a shame given that we have really nice Hall effect sticks here, and it takes away from the fact that these are nothing like a Nintendo Switch joystick and a huge improvement over them. Personally, I added some of my go-to Skull & Co caps on them, and that does solve the issue for me very easily. Okay, let's talk a bit about this finish, and I purposely did not wipe the unit down to show how it picks up on oils and fingerprints using it for several days. The plastic is coated with something known as Musashi paint, which OneX states gives it a comfortable and gentle touch. Now despite it picking up fingerprints and oils, I do have to agree with that assessment. The coating gives it a matte texture, but it doesn't quite feel like other matte devices I've used. It's very unique and does give me a more premium impression when I'm holding the device. It's surprisingly really nice. In fact, it reminded me of my old BlackBerry Playbook tablet, but I'm still finding that I like the way the texture feels on the OneXFly more. Now, I was particularly interested in the white version of the OneXFly because of my concerns with fingerprints, but surprisingly, I'm finding myself not as bothered by this. So let's spray this down and give it a nice cleaning, and you can see that it does clean up very easily. Now you're probably wondering, why am I focusing on this a bit? It's because personally, I am really just surprised at just how much I like this black finish and how it feels, and now that I have this unit in my hands, I think I'd actually go with the black over the white. Now, I do believe if you really are a stickler for fingerprints, which is usually how I am, the white model will probably be a safer option. Regardless, I really like this finishing. Also, you'll notice that in my time handling it since cleaning it, that it does take a while for it to really pick up on those oils and fingerprints, unlike some other devices that have this issue. Rubbing my thumb repeatedly across the face of the device, and again, it's surprising how well it's holding up to that. So enough of all that, let's talk about the audio. The sound is definitely a standout here on the OneXFly. The speakers get nice and loud, and at that max volume don't get distorted. As I mentioned, it's using Harman Audio EFX 2.0, which is a type of audio post-processing technology. However, the speakers themselves are definitely up to the task. Here's another sample of that audio coming through using just a YouTube clip. Okay, now let's check out the D-pad and see how it actually performs in-game, because despite commenting on the way it feels, I think it is important to see what it can actually do. I decided to continue on for my Pimax Portal review and stick to some Tatsunoko vs Capcom for the Wii, since we've got some more power under the hood here. The D-pad performs mostly well for me. I found it to be extremely responsive, hitting combos and moving around on screen. I did note that when trying to hit the lower right corner and diagonal that it would occasionally not register, resulting in me having to input the combo a second time, whereas doing the same combo in the opposite direction, it was 100% responsive without issues. And finally, I did want to take a quick look at how the analog sticks are registering here, and I will say that these sticks are excellent and responsive. I've encountered no issues with it in-game. So it's time for some of our handheld friends to join in, and we can now properly size up the OneXFly and see how it compares. You can see that for this one we have an assortment favoring some x86 based handhelds. Okay, first let's get some numbers on the OneXFly, which comes in at 598 grams or about 1 pound 5 ounces. Now I'm not sure why this is slightly higher than the 580 grams they are claiming, but this is a prototype unit, and so I'll assume final units will get in at that 580 grams. And then we'll go with the only non-x86 device I'll be including here, and always good for comparisons, with the Nintendo Switch coming in at 398 grams or about 14 ounces. Here is the GBD Win 4 6800U model, and this weighs in at a little over 1 pound 5 ounces or 609 grams. The ROG Ally at 613 grams or a little over 1 pound 5 ounces as well. And of course, finally, the big boy, the Steam Deck, coming in at 1 pound 8 ounces or just shy of 680 grams. Now let's see how the OneXFly compares in size, and it's definitely one of the selling points for this device. As you can see, the OneXFly does in fact come in as a smaller device than the ROG Ally, both in width as well as height. Part of this is achieved with the very thin bezels around the OneXFly display. Also, I think the rounded edges on the OneXFly helps with this effect. Now here's the GBD Win 4, and for sure this device is going to be much more compact than the OneXFly, since it is using a 6-inch screen instead of the 7-inch screen on the OneXFly. I do believe that the Win 4 sacrifices some comfort as well with this form factor. Here's the Nintendo Switch again, and it's not as wide as the OneXFly with its Joy-Cons attached. However, the Switch has a 6.2-inch screen with massive bezels around it, and because of that, it's almost identical in height to the OneXFly. And then of course saving the Steam Deck for last, which to no one's surprise is a lot bigger than the OneXFly. So let's go with a top-down view of all these devices and see how the thickness compares. First, let's take the thickness measurement of the OneXFly, which is a little over 22.5mm. Here's the Steam Deck, which is about 19mm. Then the GBD Win 4, which is definitely going to be the thickest device here and measures a little over 28mm. The ROG Ally, which measures in at 21mm. And then for fun, the Nintendo Switch, which will obviously be the thinnest, coming in at about 14mm. Now let's measure the face buttons and analog stick cap on the OneXFly. The face buttons are a decent size, coming in at a little over 8mm, with the analog stick cap at about 14.5mm. Now compared to the ROG Ally, which has essentially what I consider full-size face buttons, coming in at 10mm like the Xbox Series controller. The Steam Deck's face buttons are just slightly larger than the OneXFly, with it being a little over 8.5mm. And so this kinda gives us a good sense overall of just how the OneXFly measures up in various ways. Now we've talked about software and hardware, but let's get some numbers here with the 7840U and start things off with some synthetic tests and run our usual suite of benchmarks. One thing that is very important to note, it's quite well known that the 7840U drivers are a bit of a mess right now, and so I am using the OneX provided AMD drivers, and therefore these were conducted using older drivers. I do hope that we will see some optimization and improvements to the drivers for the 7840U from AMD, but regardless, let's get to testing. So let's turn things up, and I've set the OneXFly to its max 30W TDP using the overlay tool. And first up, let's start out with Geekbench 6 using the same version across all devices. Now the results here are definitely a bit confusing, as I'd expect the 7840U to be in line with the Z1 Extreme, and despite testing over and over again using all sorts of configurations, the 7840U in the OneXFly just doesn't seem to record numbers that I'd expect to see in the multi-core score. I know that the 7840U should very much be in line with the Z1 Extreme, especially based on other Geekbench 6 numbers that I've seen. However, I still wanted to present these numbers for completeness, and I do believe there is something else going on here, and at this moment, I will chalk it up to those out-of-date AMD drivers. And for our second test, here is the 3D Mark x SPY benchmark, and like our Geekbench tests, we are using the same version across all 3 devices, as well as setting all devices to that 30W TDP to get a good idea of the high power performance. This is a GPU focused benchmark, and so we can see how that 780M is performing here. And unlike the Geekbench 6 benchmark, the numbers here are what I am expecting to see, with the Z1 Extreme and the 7840U being very close in performance, and the 6800U unsurprisingly lagging behind with its older 680M graphics. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's now get into some real world testing and start out with some native PC gaming. I've broken this into 2 sections. The first set of games will be just our standard showcase of PC gaming. However, in the second part, I will specifically focus in on games and their performance at very low TDPs. So let's start things off with an older game, and I decided to feature it since it's one that I haven't talked about in a bit. I thought it would be a fun change of pace to show Doom Eternal, which is just an awesome first-person shooter and an incredibly optimized game. I don't think it's much of a surprise, but the 7840U handles this without much trouble, and so I decided to have a little bit of fun. I've set the OneXFly to use 18 watts, and Doom Eternal is set to 1080p using high settings, and it's really smooth and fluid, staying at that 60 frames per second. This is pretty incredible performance, and what it tells me is that you can easily turn the TDP down to favor battery performance if needed. Here's another really cool game making a return to the channel. Now the last time I featured it, I believe I showcased how it performed on the very underpowered Win 600, and so I think results will be very different here. Stray is a gorgeous game that uses Unreal Engine 4, and at higher settings is definitely a demanding game to run. This is another game that I'm able to keep at that 1080p resolution. Using medium settings and sticking to 18 watts, the game does very well. It's not quite enough power to keep it always running at 60 frames per second, but it never seems to go below 30 frames per second, even in more demanding areas with these settings, which I think is really fantastic performance. Again, a little lower TDP means we turn the settings down, but we can get better battery performance, and then turn the TDP up, and we can keep turning those graphical settings up. Personally, I always try to stay around the 15 to 18 watt range with x86 handhelds, as it tends to be the ideal balance between battery life and gaming performance. And finally, here's a newer PC release with the port of Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, and one I've been featuring a bit since it's a nice game to benchmark with. For Rift Apart, I have the game set to use 1080p with AMD FSR 2.1, set to a dynamic resolution scaling target of 30 frames per second using the low graphics preset. At 18 watts, this one has absolutely no issues staying at a locked 30 frames per second, and really, you can target 60 using the very low graphics preset, or you can tweak it in different ways to achieve the results you are looking for. Regardless, we have plenty of room here with the 7840U to scale up and down as we need, and so this game looks beautiful and runs very smooth here. Now before we move on to the emulation testing, and since I'm not doing a teardown segment, I wanted to feature something a little different this time. So for this part we will focus on game performance at lower TDPs to see what the OneXFly and the 7840U can handle when we turn the power way down to maximize that pretty substantial 48 watt-hour battery. I thought it would be fun and interesting to take a different perspective. So let's start out with a 2020 release. Octopath Traveler 2 from Square Enix was actually featured in my 6800U showcase, but now we get to check this one out on the OneXFly, and with the 7840U, we have enough power at 5 watts to get by with running this game using 720p resolution, a 30 frames per second cap, and low settings. I think this is a great demonstration of some of the performance we can expect at a much lower TDP, and in a little bit we will check out how long we can expect the battery to last with these settings.
Let's play. My turn. Ready?
And of course, if you're familiar with the channel, you should know that I will take any opportunity to feature Hades in a video. And it just so happens that it's also one of my favorite games to use when trying to demonstrate great games that can run using less power. For Hades, I am continuing to use that 5 watt TDP, and this game doesn't have a whole lot to tweak for its graphic settings, and so with this one, we're just using the 720p resolution to keep the frame rate nice and steady at 60 frames per second, and again, this is set to only 5 watts, and you're looking at about a 9 watt total battery draw. Finally, let's jump into another one of my favorite games, Persona 5 Royal. For this one, I bumped the TDP up slightly, and Persona seemed to be best at 7 watts, using a 720p resolution with low settings and a 75% resolution scale. This one manages to keep at that 30 frames per second lock that I have set, even in the outdoor city areas. I think this is seriously impressive performance, and with a 7-inch screen, the game still looks very nice. And remember, this is strictly meant to see how performance is like at a very low TDP, and clearly there is plenty of room here to adjust settings to favor graphics. And now that we've talked about PC gaming, I think it's time to shift gears and switch over to some high-end emulation, which the 7840U should do very well with, especially when it comes to PS3 performance, as the 7840U supports the AVX512 instruction set, just like the Z1 Extreme found in the ROG Ally, and it is definitely an improvement over the 6800U from the prior generation of x86 handhelds. And while we are on the topic of PlayStation 3 emulation, let's just start right out with it. PS3 emulation was specifically something one of my viewers had requested to see how it compares to my RPCS3 video that I did for the Ally. And so I've selected games from that video to see how it fares here on the OneXFly with the 7840U. Let's start out with a very light PS3 game. The remaster of Odin Sphere for PS3 is not a very demanding game, but I have the OneXFly set to use only 7 watts to achieve the results on screen, and it is staying at 60 frames per second. With 7 watts, we are looking at about 11 watts total system draw on that battery, which is really incredible for PS3 emulation. It's truly amazing to see how far we've come here. By the way, this game doesn't require any special settings, and definitely check out my RPCS3 video as I detail all the settings, and it's going to be quite useful for a lot of these 7840U based devices. Next up is another fairly stable game, and one that runs quite well with RPCS3. Wipeout HD Fury is one that I just can't resist showing off in videos since it's one of my favorite racing games. Similar to the ROG Ally, I like the way this one performs at 15 watts, and for fun I did turn it down a little bit to around 12 watts, and it did pretty well but had dips at certain points. So again, I really like the 15 watt setting for this game, and once shader compilation is done, it's a really smooth experience. Now let's get into a heavier game that I feature in the RPCS3 video. Here we have Sucker Punch's awesome franchise that started out on the PlayStation 3. Infamous 2 is definitely a demanding PS3 game to emulate. For this one, I decided to set the OneXFly to 25 watts, just like I had done in my Ally RPCS3 video. And not all that's unsurprising, but performance is nearly identical to what I experienced over on the Z1 Extreme. This game runs mostly at 30 frames per second, and some occasional dips into 20s in very demanding scenes, and again very similar to what I experienced on the Ally. However, this bodes very well for the 7840U, as we should expect similar performance to that Z1 Extreme. Let's now check out the other 7th generation console, the Xbox 360, using Xenia Canary. Just like I did for PS3, I will be pulling games from my Xenia Canary video that I did for the ROG Ally to see how things go here with the OneXFly and 7840U. First up is always a favorite of mine that remains exclusive to the Xbox 360, and is such a great showcase game for Xenia. Here is the original Forza Horizon, and just like the Ally, I have the OneXFly set to 15 watts, and as I expected, performance here is nearly identical, and the game runs as expected, staying at 30 frames per second with some occasional dips, mostly due to shader compilation. And let's check out a game that is a bit harder to run. Gears of War 2 is surprisingly still an Xbox 360 exclusive, so not only is it a great game to play here with Xenia Canary, this will be another great test to see how well the OneXFly and 7840U will handle this game. For this one, we will be set to 25 watts, and just like the Ally, performs nearly identical and is a very solid experience here on the OneXFly, and looks and plays really well. It's really awesome to see this, even with the lack of updated drivers for the 7040U, that we are not losing performance on the emulation front. Now let's switch over to the high-end Nintendo consoles and start right out with Nintendo Switch emulation using the Yuzu emulator. First up, I'll start out with everyone's favorite benchmark game, Super Mario Odyssey, and I'm really impressed with just how far Yuzu has come. And I have the OneXFly set to 15 watts here, and once most of the shader compilation gets out of the way, Super Mario Odyssey is buttery smooth and runs very well at its native resolution using the docked mode setting and staying at 60 frames per second with just some occasional dips. And one more game that we can check out here with Kirby and the Forgotten Land. Just like for Super Mario Odyssey, the OneXFly here is set to 15 watts, and this game requires quite a bit of shader compilation, but despite that, we'll manage to keep at its standard 30 frames per second. This game is set to its native resolution with the docked setting and runs quite well when not dealing with compilation. Overall, I think Yuzu will be a very good experience with the 7040U, and on the OneXFly, as long as compatibility is there, you shouldn't have too many issues. Finally, I'd like to check out at least one game for Wii U running with the CMU emulator, and I know that there's less exclusives now than ever before for the Wii U, but it's still fun and worthwhile to check out. I figured I could load up Yoshi's Woolly World here and see how things run. Now for this one, I've set the OneXFly to use just 10 watts, and this is a game that is definitely heavy on the shader compilation early on. But once you've gotten past most of that, this game has absolutely no issues running at just 10 watts and is a great experience on here. And of course, after all of this gaming, it's time to figure out just what we can expect from the OneXFly when it comes to battery life. Now the 7840U has proven to be quite capable, especially at lower TDPs, and so I will be conducting a range of tests here. So let's bring up some Returnal, which by the way runs great with the 7040U, and we will take a look at battery performance across the 25 watt, 15 watt, and 10 watt setting. I did this because that is actually what the ROG Ally has as default presets that can be switched on the fly, and so I thought it would be useful to compare based on those numbers. Returnal is definitely a very demanding game, but one that has lots of options to scale, and so of course I have scaled the gameplay accordingly to the power usage. Let's start on the left with the higher end test at 25 watts, and the OneXFly managed about 1 hour and 15 minutes, which is to be expected with that kind of power draw. In the middle, we have the 15 watt test, and this gets us up to about 2 hours of battery life. Finally, on the right, we have the OneXFly set to 10 watts, and this gets us to just about 3 hours of battery life. These numbers for comparison are all better than what I tested with the ROG Ally, mostly thanks to the slightly larger battery here in the OneXFly coming in at 48 watt hours. Finally, I did want to test just what we can expect using one of the lower TDP games that I featured earlier in the video. Here's Octopath Traveler again, and the OneXFly is set to use 5 watts, and this gets us about 5.5 hours of battery life, which is really nice to see. Essentially, I can take the OneXFly with me on a trip from my hometown in Phoenix and visit family on the East Coast, and I'll know that it will last me during the flight without a power source. Again, it's just something fun to think about here and show what's possible using lower power settings. And as always, one last data point I'd like to collect after all of this gaming and benchmark. Let's check out the surface temperatures of the OneXFly after going under some decent load, having the device set to 30 watts. And I have to say that I did not observe temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius, and this was only on one spot on the screen and then at the exhaust, which is to be expected. In fact, the back of the OneXFly remained very cool, and most importantly, where you hold the device, temperatures were in the low 30s. The cooling is clearly doing a very good job here, moving heat out of the device, and thermals overall are excellent even with that TDP ramped up. And so I think it's time to wrap things up. I have to say that overall I am pretty impressed by the OneXFly. I think it's a nicely constructed handheld with solid build quality and a good amount of power that comes in a compact package. It's pleasant to hold and game on, and my experience has been quite good with that Ryzen 7 7840U, and I hope that it will only get better once AMD addresses the drivers. However, the One X provided drivers have been stable and games are running quite well with solid performance. There's no denying that there is a ton of competition in the 7840U handheld space. However, as I always say, it's great that we as gamers have so many solid options today, and I think that the OneXFly is a solid option if you are looking for something on the smaller side but still packs that 7840U with very solid controls and comfort. The ultra-thin bezels are a nice touch, and surprisingly I found that matte finishing to be something that I like more than I was expecting here. Overall, I think One X has done a nice job, and this being fairly refined for a prototype has me excited to see the final product with that 120Hz screen. And so with that, I want to thank you so much for joining me through this video and checking out the OneXFly as well as the 7840U for the first time. I promise there will be plenty more to see in the future, but until then, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.